Yes, it's a sort of a biographical question that you're asking me, Alan. And yes, biographies, I think, has a way to disclose things that we don't get a chance to talk about or write about. We're so preoccupied with what you're doing in the objective sense that the subjective factor gets somewhat obscured. I was born in Calcutta, India. Salman Rushdie wrote the famous book Midnight's Children. I'm sure many of the people in your audience would know about that book. It really rocketed him to fame. Well, I'm not a part of that generation, Midnight's Children. I was born after. What he was alluding to in his book, Midnight's Children, the children born on the hour of India's partition in 1947, which, by the way, preceded by few months the UN Security Council, UN vote on the partition of Palestine. So I just mentioned that because that's where I come from, Calcutta, which is in Bengal, in undivided India, and then India was partitioned by the British in 47, and it was one of the most horrendous events after World War II in terms of movement of people, loss of life, killings, communal violence, etc. And people had to choose, and my family, that is my parent, my dad, chose to move from Calcutta, which was his hometown, to Pakistan. So I was born in Calcutta, but I was moved, and I grew up in Pakistan, in East Pakistan at that time, East Pakistan. And in the 1971 war, there had been several wars between India and Pakistan. In the 1971 war, I was a teenager, and it was a war that turned very ugly. It's again one of those things that had been forgotten. There have been so many events, so many ugly stories that people have forgotten it. But that war of 1971 was the worst killing since the end of Second World War. It is estimated somewhere between 1.5 million and 3 million people were killed by the Pakistan army and by the people supporting it. It was an internal problem that eventually led to the breakup of Pakistan. India became involved. There were 10 million people who were refugees. So what refugee problem we are seeing today, in a sense, was dwarfed by the events of 1971. Well, the long and the short of it is I was, with my mother and sibling, refugees. We survived the war, we survived the genocide. It was a miracle. We lost some members of our family, but immediate family we survived under very difficult circumstances, and we became refugees and we went to India. But in our case, my grandparents were in India. They had not moved. And so we found shelter with our grandparents in Calcutta. And then from there, I came to North America in the early 1970s. So I've been in North America. In United States, I was in the United States in 73, 74. And then I moved to Canada where I had some relatives. And I did my studies in Canada. And I'm a Canadian in every way. It's almost now 45 years that I've been in North America. I'm married. I have a son who is in his early 30s, and he's on his own, doing his own work, and mostly in business, buying and selling. And I have a daughter who's a teenager. She's just a lovely girl, joy of my eye. And my wife, she is of Arab origin. She is North African. She's from Algeria. Her story is as complicated as mine because of the conflicts that have taken place. Algeria during the 1990s was ridden with internal warfare between the radical Islamists, the precursor of Al-Qaeda, and the government forces. Over 500,000 people were killed. My wife is a doctor, a physician, an oncologist. She moved from Algeria to France, to Paris, made her home there. We met, we married. and we are in North America, very happily settled. So in every sense, I'm a North American. How and what was the key event in my life as a result of where I am in terms of my writing, in terms of my thinking, what we are doing this in Aspen, just a gorgeous place. Thank you for having me here. I'm reminded of a line from the poem of Jalaluddin Rumi. I'll translate it. It's from Farsi. If there is a paradise, this is it. This is it. This is it. So yeah, you live in paradise. It's just gorgeous. So it was 9/11. It's on the morning of 9/11. I received a phone call at about 8 o'clock. I was sleeping. I remember it distinctly. A Tuesday morning. It was a gorgeous morning, blue sky. I'd gone to bed very late, as I do normally, reading, studying, whatever it was the previous night. And I get a call from a radio station asking me to comment on what was. I said, "What are you asking me to comment about?" And he said, "You don't know?" I said, "No, what is it?" The person calling me, Jim Chapman, he had me on his program many a time, so he knew me. He said, "Salim, go and open your television." So rubbing my eyes, I went and opened a television just in time for the second plane hitting one of the towers. And I knew instinctively that what I had escaped from, what my wife had escaped from, had followed us right here into this world. That we are not in the thick of it. It was no longer over there that terrorism, violence, madness that has been all a life that I grew up with, as I mentioned, the 1971 war, the genocide, the refugee, the killings that I witnessed and escaped from, and my wife in Algeria and North Africa, and here we were in the midst of it all. And it was very clear that we cannot walk away from it, we cannot remain silent, and I felt it now was my responsibility, my book, both as a university professor in terms of my subject. I'm a political economist by training, but it was now time for me to really focus on this issue and warn my compatriots both in Canada and the United States of what is at stake, what are the issues, and that's what I have been doing over these past 17, 18 years. You're right, Alan, they messed things up, but I think the subtext of the question is, did they do it deliberately, or was it again something that they were trying to extricate themselves from, into which they had become so deeply involved that they had no answer. It is said about the British, and I write about it in my book as an allusion to it in my recent book, The Qur'an Problem and Islamism, that the British acquired an empire absent-mindedly. It all began sometime in the 18th century, looking for the spice trade and the proverbial gold, the age of discovery and sailings and trade and commerce, led the British as it led the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish to Asia. They found the route into Asia. Vasco da Gama discovered the route from Europe around the Cape of Good Hope to India and so on. Magellan circled the world. And then the trade began, and it was in the pursuit of trade with the East that led to setting up their trading center, and then that evolved into eventually empires, and Britain had the largest of all the European empires. Having had the empire, it is the Europeans, I tell my students, that is not simply what you're witnessing in the Middle East or in the Muslim world, the madness. Madness is part of human condition, or going insane, or going arrogant, and then tipping the scale. We from India talk about karma. I'm sure you know the term karma. Everything has its cause and effect and consequences. And unintended consequences are the most important thing to take note of, because the intended consequences we know and we deal with it. Again, I tell my students, You see each other and you fall in love in a blink of a moment. And before you know, you cohabit, you marry, and then you wonder what happened. At 3 o'clock in the morning, you're waking up to clean up the diapers of your baby. And all that takes us. That's the unintended consequences that nobody has planned. And life is full of unintended consequences. So the British Empire was that. And yes, so the Europeans committed basically a suicide twice over in the last century, and we are living the consequences of that. World War I and World War II, and by the time World War II ended, Europe was finished. The age of Europe is over. They had committed harakiri, and so the rapid extrication from the empire that they could not sustain, and that's what led to the partition, both in India and in Palestine. Basically an abject withdrawal after almost 300 years. In the case of Palestine, it was not 300 years. It was basically from the end of World War I. So it's a small gap, 30 years. But in the case of India, it was almost 250 years. And India was the crown jewel of the British Empire. And everything that Britain came to acquire worldwide, including Palestine, was in defense of the crown jewel. And by the way, Calcutta was the capital of the British Empire. It was the city that the British built. It was called the Paris of the East. So the city that I was born in and with which I'm attached emotionally to the extent as a birth city is a very rich city in terms of culture, in terms of what it represented. For instance, it is the city of Mother Teresa. She has been she has been sainted. She's the Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta. It's a city that has won again from a third world country. It's a city that has its citizens have won 6 Nobel Prizes. So it is a very, very significant city with a very significant history. Qur'an problem, very good question, and I gave it the title of my book. In my view, the Qur'an problem is how do you read and understand it? How is it interpreted, and then how it is taken into action? Because from the Muslim belief system or Muslim point of view, the Quran is the sacred word of God. It is the revelation. It is the words that were spoken to Muhammad. Now that's a matter of belief. For Muslims, they take that as a belief, just as the Christian take Jesus born of a Virgin Mary, an immaculate conception, a matter of belief. But after having said that, the Quran is now a text. The Quran is a text. And all text has to be read and understood and explained and interpreted and contextualized. But all texts are not scriptures. The Quran is both a text and a scripture. It is sacred. And a lot rides on how it is understood. And the Quran problem, as I discussed it in my book, because it is at the heart of the problem, the challenge that the Muslims are facing today, as they have faced right from the beginning of their history of Islam, the origin of Islam, that goes back 14 centuries to the time of the Prophet and after, is that all their action, all their understanding and relationship with others in some ways have to be connected to their reading of the Quran. And therefore, the text can become a very dangerous weapon if it is not handled properly and read properly. And that's what has happened. Much of the problem, much of the struggle, the violence, the Prophet's entire family was eliminated soon after he died. Wars started among the tribes over the issue of the Quran and how it is to be understood. And it has continued. So on the one side, the Quran has been in more ways than we can put it together in terms of explaining it and talking about it and illuminating the fact that it built a civilization. Just as the Bible, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament together, the Judeo-Christian religion, which is based upon a text, and both Islam and Judaism and Christianity are textual religion. The Bible is at the heart of the making of the modern post-Roman world in terms of Europe, Christendom. And the Quran is at the heart of the making of the Islamic civilization. So where we have come today, the challenge is, can the Quran, though for the Muslim, can the Quran validate their desire to be part of the modern world, or is the Quran an impediment in some ways, an obstruction to their embracing, reconciling with the modern world? And in this sense, the struggle that is going on right now, which is again over the reading of the Quran and understanding of it and acting upon it, is analogous to what has happened in the making of the West, if people really sit and think about it. For instance, Alan, last year, just a few months ago, October of 2017, marked the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther pinning the 95 Theses on a church door in Wittenberg, Bavaria, which, according to historians, was the key instrument that ignited what later on came to be known as the Protestant Reformation. And it, this process that began in October of 1517 went on over centuries. And some might say it is not yet over, because that struggle goes on. And how is the Bible to be understood? Who has the authority to explain what is the meaning of the Bible? And if the Bible, and in the case of the Quran even more so, that is, the Muslim believe the Quran is the word of God. In other words, God is revealing himself through words, which is also the Jewish understanding of revelation. God speaks to Moses. Moses is the most unique man. God speaks to him. And then that's the idea that is then repeated. God speaks to Muhammad. How do you enter God's mind? Who has the capacity, and who is that person who would say that I understand this infinite mind, me, a finite creature, and I am going to impose my understanding, upon you or the rest of you? That's the struggle, and that's what led to the making of it. It broke the church. Catholic Church power was broken, the rise of Protestant, and so on and so forth. So in Islam, we are going through the same or similar conflict that is happening. And unless Muslims come to terms that the Quran itself is in no way an impediment or obstruction to their living in the modern world, embracing the modern world, reconciling. The Quran is a book of moral direction. It is not a book of economics and physics and astronomy, even though there are allusions to it, or as the Muslim Brotherhood, they declare the Quran is our constitution. Then, unless the Muslim come to understand, no, Quran is a book of moral direction, and the rest is us, what we do and what we make, the struggle will carry on, and it is carrying on. And so what we are seeing now, what we are witnessing now, the Quran problem, what we are witnessing is indeed, if we pause and think and reflect upon it, as opposed to the media narrative, what is happening in our lifetime is, if you want to understand what had happened in Europe and what was the Protestant Reformation, what was the Christian Revolution, what led to the French Revolution and all the various revolutions, either in the name of Christianity or in opposition to Christianity, as understood by the people at that time. If you want to understand that, all we have to do is witness the Muslim world, because that's what is being played out, the relationship of gender, the relationship between and among Muslims, the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims, and how a society will construct legitimate authority, which is the key issue. So that's the Quran problem.
Yeah, and I think it would.
Yeah, this development about political correctness that has now consuming us, our generation, is something completely new. It happened in our lifetime. When I was an undergraduate student at University of Toronto, I'm going back to mid to late 70s, I, not knowingly, but in retrospect, very fortunate, I walked into Professor Alan Bloom's class, political philosopher. I don't know if you recall the name. He wrote the book, The Closing of the American Mind, which was published in 1987, and it became a huge bestseller. And for the whole year, it was on the top 10 of the New York Times best-selling book. It is very rare that a thick, dense work on political philosophy would become a bestseller on New York Times, both fiction and non-fiction lists. So I walked into his class, and I audited some of his lecture, which went into the book. So I raised that. This is 87. We're going back 31 years. And Professor Bloom was talking about the closing of the American mind, why it happened, what had happened. What he meant by it, again, what you have raised, Alan, that certain subjects became taboo, certain way of thinking became taboo. And in his case, what he was discussing, the Western canon of literature, that is reading and writing and talking about it for students in social sciences and humanities, doing anthropology or philosophy or literature, etc. The canon of texts that people began and read, which we all did at some point in our studies, and then the rest of the life, begins with, you go back to Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, and you come all the way down to Tocqueville and, into modern times with writers like Sir Isaiah Berlin and Voltaire and so on, so Bertrand Russell. But the long and the short of it is that this rich literature happened to be written by people of white pigmentation, if you might say, Caucasian background, Christian, European, what have you. And so what is missing in there is African names and Arab names or black people, etc. And so a whole pressure began of including others. To including others mean diluting the canon of literature, and eventually the canon of literature got so diluted that it became very narrow. Students went into the university or colleges and they did African studies. They were American, they did Africa. So they might know a lot about Congo or South Africa, but they had very little clue of trying to put these things in perspective of the larger picture of how did the world come about, in the making of the modern world, going back all the way to Greece, which is, the cradle of the Western civilization in some sense, to our time, and then insisting that not including the literature of Africa or the literature of India or what have you, the Caribbean, you are racist. You are in some way, you're demeaning other people. And that worked its way into this whole situation over time that has come about as the Western world has become increasingly multi-ethnic. That's the term that I prefer as opposed to multicultural, you know. Until about the early 1960s, just as America was getting involved in the Vietnam War, for all sorts of other reasons of global necessity and strategy, the Cold War, there was something parallel that was happening. America opened its doors for letting people from the rest of the world come to America as immigrants. Immigration was in some ways restricted before Second World War. You recall, as people of Jewish background, what had happened when European Jews tried to escape in the 1930s from Nazi Germany and Europe under siege. The Americans and the Western governments were not open to let them in. There were not immigration or movement of people from Africa or the Caribbean or from my part of the world. Anyhow, so America became more multi-ethnic. Canada became more multi-ethnic. And a debate began about, you know, is this American exceptionalism, is this American history going to be the one that we have experienced all through? Again, the bicentennial year was coming up, 1976. Or America is changing. America is becoming more diverse and more plural. And so the idea of multiculturalism arose, that America, Canada, Western Europe is no longer simply a white Caucasian European culture. It is culture of many people. And the moment that that idea was picked up and pushed, particularly by people on the more quote-unquote progressive end or on the left of the political spectrum, it meant, to use that analogy, of adding more water to the wine, you know, so either the glass becomes more water or loses its quality of the wine. That's what happened. The more the emphasis was on multiculturalism, the history of America then took on a different meaning and has led to where we are today, you see. And in this sense, the America that was of Mark Twain or of, you know, Emerson, Walt Whitman, is now a much different America. And to talk about that America becomes simply a coded word that you're denying all the other diversity, and it carries on that notion of some sort of ethnocentrism or multiculturalism. And that's most unfortunate. I believe that most of us immigrants, and I can speak for myself, we came to the West, to North America. We are what we are in terms of our own development and growth. I, as somebody, a Muslim from India, but at the same time, I wanted to be North American. You know, I wanted to embrace and to know North America. And others who have come under the new idea of multiculturalism, they insist that they want to maintain their own identity, and the politics is how much of that identity you want to maintain, which leads to all the subsequent question, which is the question of Islam. Now you're coming in, because there is an internal struggle going on within the Muslim world between how the Muslim world is going to adapt itself to the 21st century, to modernity, to modernization. And those who are critical about it, immediately in a defensive mode, they're attacked as you're being Islamophobic. I think that is not only sad and that is not only unhelpful, I think it takes away from the argument that the Muslims themselves are engaged in and others have to engage in, because Islam and the Muslim world is not something separate and apart from the earth. We are not Martian. We are here, and what is happening in the Middle East, what is happening in India, what is happening in Africa has huge impact globally. What is happening, you know, in the conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis has huge impact globally. And so everybody has a right to talk about it, and because the problems have to be understood, and if there is a resolution, that resolution must come also globally, so we are all participants in it. Well, it is again, as the discussion of multiculturalism and Islamophobia indicates, we are going through that wave at our present time, where ironically, the very strength of the Western civilization or of America, which is based upon freedom of speech, freedom of association, ultimately the idea that the individual is the key factor in history, the motivating force of change, the agency of change. Because ultimately, the minority is the individual. And a good society, in that classical sense of John Locke or any of the philosophers, classical liberal philosophers, a good society is the one that provides protection for the minority, that protects the minority. And so the individual is the ultimate minority. And so freedom of speech represents that. The Chinese Nobel Prize winner in 2010 for peace was a man under imprisonment and subsequently died, Li Xiaobo. And Li Xiaobo had a famous saying. It went something like this: of all the freedom of speech is the mother of all freedom. You take away my speech, you take away my breath, and that is the end of me. So, what we find today in this new situation with the Western world more and more multi-ethnic, if not multicultural, is the idea of freedom of speech is under siege. That the people from different parts of the world who have come with different understanding of their culture and who have grown up in different value systems that do not have or do not share the value which is, in a sense, the sacred value of, say, the American Constitution, the First Amendment. If America has a sacred text apart from the Bible, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, it is the Constitution. And the fight is taking place over the Constitution. So the First Amendment. And that amendment is under siege. People want to, in some way, abridge that amendment. In Canada, where we don't have that First Amendment, in Europe, where we don't have that First Amendment right, the situation, relatively speaking, worsens. Because there we have ended up in a situation where we have identified any speech that is considered provocative or threatening or perceived as provocative and threatening by a certain group of people or any group of people would then be identified or defined as hate speech, and it has been defended in our legal system. So hate speech is there, and we have now Human Rights Commission investigating situations and circumstances where people have brought complaint against individual writers, professors, artists, saying that they have indulged in hate speech and have been taken to court. And so that is not only an abridgment in terms of American situation, the First Amendment right, it is in a sense dreadful because it is bringing down the curtain on the very thing that was unique about the West in contrast to the non-Western societies, whether it was during the days of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, or pretty much across the Arab Muslim world, Third World. Freedom is not understood. Freedom doesn't exist. Freedom, that is the freedom to be an individual, to think, to speak, to write, to do what an individual, without in any way, as John Stuart Mill says, the freedom to express so long, and unrestrained so long I don't harm anybody, And that I believe was the Oliver Wendell Holmes statement, you don't have the freedom to call fire in a crowded theater, but so long you don't harm anybody, you have that. That is being censored. That doesn't exist in another part of the world. And so coming to the situation, what I found in my case was that my public writing, my public speaking and work was under attack, and I was being censored. People wrote to the university asking my president and the university administration to not only curtail what I was doing in the public arena, but to fire me. They said that I was engaged in hate speech, and that they would bring the Human Rights Commission to take me to court. For some reason, it did not happen. It happened with some of my people whom I know. The most famous case was that of Mark Stein and Ezra Levant. And I know both of them very closely, and I've written with them and worked with them. But in my situation, though official complaints were made about me, about hate speech, and I was threatened that I would be taken to court, it did not happen. And I don't know why exactly it did not happen. Perhaps the people who made those threats didn't want to take me to court because they would then have to explain. And in the optics of the situation, it would show that, again, a Muslim organization, as happened with Ezra Levant and Mark Stein, it was the Canadian Islamic Congress, that a Muslim organization is persecuting or is indicting another Muslim who is engaged in writing about Islam and Muslim as a Muslim. And so they backed off. But our universities have become ground where this pressure is built up, and our administration and our faculty members have to take that into account. And so even though censorship might not be done in a sense being directed against an individual, it is being done prudentially. And that's the worst, when you start self-censoring yourself, because you're trying to be overly cautious, overly prudent, and then discussion becomes more or less a pablum. Nobody seems to want to touch the elephant in the room.
Professor, thank you so much.
Thank you.